The Wyoming wind didn't just blow, it screamed, carrying a frost so deep it could stop a man's heart in mid-beat. Elias Thorne thought he'd seen every cruelty this territory could offer until his eyes locked on the impossible shape stumbling through the drifts. Not a deer, but a woman named Sarah Miller walking barefoot on ice that had already claimed her husband. Elias pulled the reins so hard the leather groaned, avoiding any questions about what devil was chasing her. He just looked at her bleeding feet and spoke the only words that mattered: "Get in the wagon." Before we ride deeper into this story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The weight of her body and his arms was wrong, terrifyingly wrong, as if the winder had already hollowed her out and left nothing but a shell of ice and fabric. Elias Thorne gritted his teeth against the gale, the wind screaming in his ears with a voice that sounded almost human, a shrieking demand to leave the woman to the drift. He ignored it, placing Sarah Miller gently onto the rough wood of the wagon bed, covering her with a buffalo robe that was stiff with frost. She didn't groan. She didn't shiver. That stillness frightened him more than the whiteout consuming the world around him. He climbed the wagon bench, the leather reins biting into his stiffened palms, and snapped them over the backs of his team. The horses, massive bays with icicles hanging from their manes, lunged forward, fighting the deep snow that tried to swallow their hooves. Steam rose from their heaving flanks in thick, white columns, a violent contrast of heat against the freezing gray void, looking like spirits escaping their bodies with every labored breath. The journey back to the cabin was a battle of inches. The wheels crunched over hidden eyes, a rhythmic grinding that sounded like bones breaking in the distance. Elias kept twisting in his seat, his eyes not on the invisible road ahead but on the silent shape behind him. He reached back to tuck the robe tighter around her, and his hand grazed her wrist where the sleeve had ridden up. The skin was marble white, yes, but marred by dark, unmistakable rings of purple and black. The cold turns a body blue, but it does not leave the imprint of fingers. It does not leave the mark of a man's grip. A sick heat flared in Elias's chest, a sudden rage that cut through the numbness of the blizzard. She hadn't just wandered off. She had been dragged. She had been held. He whipped the horses, the crack of the leather sounding like a gunshot, driving them blindly toward the salvation of home. When the cabin finally materialized from the swirling white, it looked like a tombstone in a graveyard of snow. He didn't wait to unhitch the team. He hauled Sarah into his arms again, kicking the heavy oak door open and stumbling into the pitch black of the interior. The wind slammed the door shut behind them, cutting off the scream of the storm, leaving a silence so sudden it made his ears ring. He moved by memory in the dark, his boots heavy on the floorboards, laying her on the hearth rug before fumbling for a match. The strike flared, a tiny explosion of sulfur and yellow light. Shadows leapt back into the corners, fleeing the expanding circle of gold. The light washed over Sarah's face, revealing the devastation in high relief, the cracked lips, the snow matted in her lashes, the terrifying pallor of her skin. Elias knelt to build the fire, his hands shaking now, not from the cold, but from the realization that the storm outside was nothing compared to the darkness that had chased this woman to his door. The iron kettle suspended over the roaring hearth hissed with a violent, spitting energy that seemed too loud for the small, timber-walled room, a sharp and rhythmic counterpoint to the low, mournful moaning of the Wyoming gale that battered the cedar shingles outside. Elias Thorne moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a man who had lived too long in silence, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the rough-hewn logs as he dipped a heavy woolen rag into the steaming water, the heat of the cabin acting as a physical weight that pressed against the frozen memory of the storm they had just escaped. The woman on the rug, Sarah Miller, shivered violently beneath the mound of buffalo robes, a deep, seismic tremor that seemed to originate from the marrow of her bones rather than the air touching her skin. And Elias knelt beside her, his knees cracking audibly in the stillness, looking down at the ruin of her feet with eyes that had seen too much death to be easily shaken, yet found themselves disturbed by the specific intimacy of this suffering. Her feet were pale as marble, threaded with angry, spiderweb veins of blue and purple, the flesh raw and blistered where the ice had chewed it away. and he hesitated for a long moment, the rough calluses of his fingers hovering inches from her skin, caught in a paralysis of his own making. This was not his burden, for he had come to this high, lonely place to escape the responsibilities of life, to serve a penance of solitude for sins that no amount of prayer could scrub clean. Yet here was life, bloody and broken, dragged across his threshold and demanding his care. He dipped the cloth again, wringing it out until the water dripped rhythmically back into the basin. Drip, 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 a sound that measured the passing seconds of a night that refused to end. He touched the warm cloth to her instep, and she clenched in her unconscious state, a low, guttural whimper escaping her cracked lips that sounded like a plea to a god who had stopped listening miles ago, forcing Elias's jaw to tighten as the muscles worked beneath his graying beard. He focused on the task, treating the flesh with a detachment he did not truly feel, forcing himself to be a medic when his heart wanted only to be a hermit, applying a salve that smelled of pine pitch and bear grease, the pungent scent filling the small space and warring with the metallic tang of old blood and wet wool. Every minute that ticked by was a violation of the order he had built. His cabin was a tomb for the living, a place of dust and silence, not a sanctuary for battered women with secrets written in the bruises on their wrists. He saw those bruises now, revealed as her sleeve slipped further up, dark, finger-shaped welts that spoke of a grip meant to control, to hurt, to possess. They were not the random cruelty of nature like the frostbite. They were the calculated cruelty of a man. Elias felt a familiar, dark heat on coil in his gut, the same rage he had buried beneath 6 feet of snow in 3 years of isolation, and he hated her for bringing it back, hated that she made him feel necessary again when he had worked so hard to become obsolete. He sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched the rise and fall of her chest, which was shallow, ragged, clinging to life with a stubbornness that baffled him. Why fight so hard when the snow was peaceful and the sleep was eternal? But she had walked until her feet bled and the cold took her senses, driven by something stronger than the instinct to survive. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and the light danced across her face, softening the lines of pain, making her look impossibly young and tragically used. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, the tin cup rattling against the pot, the noise startlingly loud in the quiet. He sat in his rocking chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and kept vigil, his rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach, a habit he hadn't broken even here. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, a long pause in the narrative of the night where the only story being told was the wind and the breathing. He watched the shadows lengthen and contract, the dark to light transitions playing out on the floorboards, marking time in a world that had forgotten him. He thought of the wolf he had seen last winter, caught in a trap, gnawing at its own leg to be free, and realized that was the look she had about her, the desperation of the trap. Suddenly, the rhythm of the room shattered as Sarah gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded like drowning, and her body jackknifed upright on the rug. Her eyes flew open, wide and unseeing, filled with a terror so pure it sucked the oxygen out of the room. She didn't see the fire, or the blankets, or the safety of the hearth. She saw only the darkness of her own mind and the monsters inhabiting it. When her frantic gaze landed on Elias, a looming, bearded shadow wreathed in smoke, she didn't see a savior, but the devil who had chased her. She scrambled backward, her ruined feet scrambling uselessly against the floor, a scream tearing from her throat that was raw and animalistic. She grabbed a piece of firewood, brandishing it like a weapon, her hands shaking so violently the wood blurred in the firelight. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice a ruin of gravel and fear, barely recognizable as human. "Don't you touch me. I won't go back." Elias didn't move, didn't stand, didn't reach for her. He sat perfectly still in the chair, knowing that any sudden movement would snap the fragile thread of her sanity. He let her scream, let her panic fill the room until it hit the walls and bounced back. Exhausted, he looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable, holding her gaze with a steadiness that was an anchor in her storm. He waited until her chest was heaving, until the adrenaline began to sour into exhaustion, until she realized he wasn't reaching for her, wasn't hurting her. Then, and only then, did he speak, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, sparing and minimalist, offering no comfort but the truth. "You're not going back," he said, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Look at the fire. Look at the walls. The snow didn't take you, and neither did he." Sarah blinked, the reality of the cabin slowly seeping in, replacing the nightmare. She looked at the fire, then at her bandaged feet, and finally back at the old man in the chair who looked less like a hero and more like a weary mountain carved from granite. The wood dropped from her hand, clattering loudly on the floor, and she slumped, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a crushing, suffocating guilt. The guilt of the survivor who knows she is alive only because someone else is dead. She covered her face with her hands and wept, not the loud sobbing of a child, but the silent, shaking grief of a woman who has lost everything but her life, while Elias watched her, feeling the solitude of his cabin shatter completely, knowing that the silence of his ghosts had been replaced by the weeping of hers, and that come morning, the world outside would be waiting to finish what it started. The morning light that eventually bled through the frosted window panes wasn't hopeful. It was a dull, slate-gray bruising of the sky that promised more snow, casting a pallid, sickly glow over the interior of the cabin where two strangers sat suspended in the aftermath of violence. Elias placed a tin cup of coffee into Sarah's trembling hands, the metal hot enough to burn, but she didn't flinch, her fingers curling around it not for the drink but for the anchor of heat in a world that had turned impossibly cold. She stared into the black liquid as if reading the future in the dregs, and when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't speaking to Elias but seemed to be narrating a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, the words tumbling out in a fractured internal monologue that bridged the gap between living and the dead. She didn't begin with the shooting, she began with the boots, the memory of them so visceral it seemed to suck the warmth right out of the hearth fire. She described the sound of the laces snapping, the specific, sickening intimacy of Silas Vance kneeling in the snow before her, not to beg, not to help, but to rob. The narration of her memory moved with a slow, excruciating precision, detailing how Vane had looked at her with eyes as flat and empty as a frozen lake, his face devoid of anger or passion, possessed only by a terrifying, bureaucratic indifference. He hadn't wanted to waste a bullet on a woman, she explained to the silence of the room, because bullets leave holes and holes raise questions that sheriffs feel obligated to answer. But the cold is natural, the cold is blameless, the cold is just Wyoming doing what Wyoming does. She recounted the sensation of his gloved hands, rough and smelling of gun oil, gripping her ankles, the surreal horror of him untying the knots with a patience that was more terrifying than any shout, stripping the leather from her feet while her husband's body lay cooling not 10 feet away, his blood melting red cavities into the white drift. It was a cruelty so specific, so calculated, that it hung in the air of the cabin like a poisonous fog. Vane had calculated the miles to the nearest town, calculated the dropping temperature, and calculated exactly how long a woman in cotton stockings could last before the frost took her legs and then her part. He had sentenced her to a death that would look like an accident, a tragic story of a grieving widow wandering off and losing her way, leaving him with clean hands and a clear title. And that was the pivot, the heavy iron hinge upon which this tragedy swung. The title, the deed, the scrap of paper that legitimized the bloodshed. Sarah's voice cracked, shifting from the horror of the boots to the reason behind them, her internal dialogue spilling out the truth about the water. It wasn't gold Vane was after. It was the sweet, year-round spring that bubbled up on the Millerstead, the only water for 20 miles that didn't freeze solid in January, the lifeblood that Vane's massive cattle empire was slowly dying without. He had offered to buy it, then he had demanded it, and finally, yesterday, he had come to take it. She told the story of the deed not as a legal matter, but as a death warrant, describing how her husband John had laughed in Vane's face, a laugh that ended with a crack of a Winchester and the thud of a body hitting the earth. But Vane had made a mistake, a singular, arrogant error born of a man who believes he is a god in his own valley. He assumed the deed was in John's saddlebags, or in the house he had burned to the ground. He didn't know that in those frantic, final moments before the confrontation, Sarah had sewn the document into the lining of her coat, or that she had shoved it into the hollow of a dead tree, or, no, the truth was even more desperate. She looked up at Elias then, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, feverish intensity, and revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the reason she had survived the walk that should have killed her. She hadn't just been walking away from death. She was walking toward justice, carrying the one thing that could destroy Silas Vane. She tapped her chest, a hollow thump against the sternum. She didn't have the deed on her. She had hidden it in the one place Vane wouldn't look, a place she had passed in her delirium. The mystery revealed dropped into the quiet room with the weight of a stone. She had shoved the oilskin packet containing the deed into the undercarriage of Elias's own wagon when he had stopped to pick her up, in that blur of motion before she lost consciousness. She wasn't just a refugee, she was a courier of Vane's destruction, and by bringing her here, by letting that wagon sit in his barn, Elias hadn't just saved a woman, he had stolen the future of the most dangerous man in the territory. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, shifting his role instantly from a Samaritan to an accomplice, bound by the laws of moral gravity to a war he hadn't chosen. He looked at the woman, barefoot and broken, and saw the steel spine beneath the trauma, realizing that Vane had taken her boots to stop her. But he had forgotten that a person doesn't need shoes to stand their ground when they have nothing left to lose. The wind outside howled again, but this time it sounded less like a mournful cry and more like a warning, a reminder that Vane would come looking for his loose end. And when he found the tracks of a wagon leading away from the scene of his crime, he would follow them to the gates of hell if he had to. Elias looked at his rifle, then at the door, knowing the peace he had cultivated for 3 years was as dead as John Miller, sacrificed on the altar of a single, shocking act of cruelty, a man stealing a widow's boots to let Winter do his killing. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the heavy, charged silence of a fuse burning down, the quiet before the war, and the ghost of Silas Vane stood in the room with them, invisible and terrifying, his footprints stamped not in the snow, but on their lives. The wind had shifted by midday, dropping from a scream to a sinister whisper that curled around the eaves of the cabin like a thief testing a latch, carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Elias stood by the split-rail fence, his breath misting in the frigid air, his eyes narrowed against the blinding glare of the snowpack that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was in that vast, white emptiness that he saw them, 3 dark imperfections on the purity of the drift, jagged tears in the landscape that moved with a slow, predatory intent. They were miles out, mere specks of charcoal against the diamond dust of the plains, but Elias knew what they were instantly. A man does not survive the frontier without learning the shape of trouble long before it arrives at his gate. He watched them come, the rhythmic rise and fall of the horses breaking the crust of the snow, and in that suspended moment, the world seemed to slow down, offering him a terrifying clarity. This was the foreshadowing of his own end, a dark destiny riding hard to meet him, and the realization brought with it a cold, seductive temptation that was harder to fight than the frost. He could walk away. The thought bloomed in his mind with the logic of survival. He could saddle his own horse, ride into the timber, and leave the cabin to its fate, or he could simply stand aside, open the door, and let Vane's men take the woman who had brought this storm down upon him. Why should he bleed for Sarah Miller? She was a stranger, a ghost story that had stumbled into his living room, and he was an old man who had paid his dues to violence and wanted only the quiet of his final years. The moral dilemma wasn't abstract. It was a physical weight on his chest, the heavy pull of self-preservation urging him to remain the hermit, to remain the bystander, to let the wolves take the wounded deer so the winter would leave him be. He looked at the approaching riders, measuring the distance, calculating the time. He had 20 minutes to wash his hands of the whole bloody affair. But then he turned his head and looked back at the cabin, seeing the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, a fragile testament to the life he had warmed back into existence. He thought of the boots. He thought of a man who would strip a woman's feet and leave her to the ice. And in that thought, the temptation to do nothing withered and died, replaced by a steely, fatalistic resolve that settled into his bones like iron. He was not a hero, but he was a man, and there were lines drawn in the snow that a man did not cross, and lines he did not let others cross. He turned from the fence, his boots crunching loudly as he strode back to the cabin, the pacing of his life shifting from the slow drift of a hermit to the sharp, staccato rhythm of a soldier. He burst through the door, bringing the cold air with him, and Sarah looked up from the hearth, her eyes widening as she read the news on his face. "They're here," Elias said, the dialogue woven directly into the narration, minimalist and high impact, offering no room for panic. He didn't wait for her to ask who. He moved to the center of the room and kicked aside the braided rug, revealing the iron ring of the root cellar trapdoor. He heaved it open, the smell of damp earth and raw potatoes rising up to meet the smell of wood smoke, a scent of the grave that felt uncomfortably prophetic. "Down," he commanded, not unkindly, but with the urgency of a man hearing the clock ticking down. Sarah hesitated, looking at the dark hole, then at the window where the horizon was hiding monsters, and she understood. She didn't argue. She scrambled toward him, wincing as her bandaged feet dragged, and he helped her lower herself into the gloom, handing her a box of matches and a jug of water. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, the words dropping into the darkness like coins into a well. "Not if they burn the roof down. Not if they kill me. You stay quiet." He lowered the heavy door, sealing her beneath the floorboards, and kicked the rug back into place, smoothing the edges with a frantic precision. The cabin was empty again, save for him, but the air was thick with the emotional gravitas of what was coming. Elias moved to the mantel, his hands reaching for the heavy Winchester 1873 that hung on the pegs, a weapon he hadn't fired in anger since the chaotic days of the range wars. The metal was cold against his palms, a familiar, deadly extension of his will. He sat on the bench by the door and reached into a box of cartridges, the brass gleaming dully in the filtered light. Click. The first bullet slid into the loading gate. This was for the piece he was losing. Click. The second was for the woman shaking in the dirt beneath his feet. Click. The third was for the man who stole boots. He loaded the rifle with rhythmic, ceremonial slowness, each metallic snap a punctuation mark in the sentence of his life, the sound loud in the quiet room. He didn't check the sights, he knew where they hit. He didn't pray, he knew who was listening. He simply worked the lever, chambering a round with a mechanical fluidity that belied his age, the sound of the action closing echoing like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The rhythmic acceleration toward the climax was now a physical sensation, a throbbing in his blood that matched the hoofbeats he could now hear vibrating through the floorboards. He wasn't Elias Thorne, the hermit, anymore. He was the gatekeeper, the obstacle, the wall against which the wave of Vane's cruelty would break. He set the rifle across his lap, poured the rest of his coffee into the fire, watching it hiss and steam as it vanished, and turned his chair to face the door. The shadows on the perimeter had become the monsters at the gate, and Elias sat in the dim light, a statue of judgment carved from regret and gunpowder, waiting for the knock that he knew would come not with a hand, but with a boot. The silence that descended upon the cabin after the door was bolted was not the peaceful quiet of the winter wilderness, but the suffocating, pressurized stillness of a trap waiting to be sprung, a silence that was shattered only moments later by the heavy, rhythmic thud of hoofbeats crushing the crust of the snowpack outside. Elias Thorne stood by the window, peering through a crack in the shutter, his heart beating a slow, deliberate tattoo against his ribs, the heartbeat of a man who had traded the plow for the rifle long ago and remembered the weight of both. He watched as three riders emerged from the tree line, their forms dark and jagged against the blinding whiteness of the valley, looking like ink spilled on a pristine page. They rode with the arrogance of men who owned the land they trampled, their long canvas dusters coated in a rime of frost that cracked and shifted with every movement, their hats pulled low to shield their eyes from the biting glare. The leader, a man whose face was a topographical map of violence, sat atop a massive black gelding that snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air, the vapor rising in thick, white plumes that obscured his features for a terrifying second before the wind tore them away. Elias knew he had seconds to transition, to shed the skin of the capable protector and don the mask of the harmless eccentric, a transformation that had to be absolute if he wanted to survive the next 10 minutes. He turned from the window, his posture collapsing inward, his shoulders rounding, his gait shifting from a stride to a shuffle, and he unlocked the door with a clumsy, fumbling hand that shook with a calculated tremor. He stepped out onto the porch just as the riders reined in at the fence line, the leather of their saddles groaning in the cold air, the metal of their bits jingling with a cheerful sound that was entirely at odds with the menace radiating from the men. Elias blinked rapidly against the light, his mouth hanging slightly open, looking for all the world like a man whose mind had been eroded by too many winters alone. "If you're selling Bibles," Elias croaked, his voice a masterpiece of withered disuse, "the Lord and I stopped speaking in '84, and I ain't looking to reopen the negotiation." The leader didn't smile. His eyes, cold and flat as river stones, swept over the porch, the woodpile, and finally settled on Elias with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "Not selling," the gunman said, the dialogue minimalist and high impact, the words dropping into the space between them like lead weights. "Hunting." The single word hung in the air, heavy with implication, and Elias leaned forward, cupping a hand to his ear in a pantomime of deafness that forced the man to repeat himself, stripping the intimidation from his voice by reducing it to a shout. "Hunting." The man barked, his hand drifting instinctively toward the heavy dragoon pistol on his hip. A woman. Red coat. No shoes. She came this way. Elias looked around the empty expanse of snow, his head swiveling on his neck like a confused owl, before letting out a dry, wheezing laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on stone. "No women here," he rasped, wiping his nose on his sleeve in a gesture of gross incivility designed to repel them. "Just the wind and the wolves. And the wolves don't wear shoes." The gunman wasn't satisfied. He leaned over the neck of his horse, the animal shifting its weight nervously, sensing the tension flowing through the reins. "Tracks lead to your gate, old man," the gunman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that cut through the wind. "Wagon tracks. Fresh." It was the moment of the lie, the precipice upon which their lives balanced, and Elias didn't blink. He gestured vaguely toward the barn, his hand trembling. "My wagon," he mumbled, his eyes losing focus, drifting to the horizon. "Went for wood. Yesterday? Maybe Tuesday. Time gets slippery when the snow falls." The mare. "She sees ghosts in the pine." "You see ghosts?" He looked up at the gunman with a pathetic, watery gaze, offering a senile question in place of an answer. The gunman stared at him, dissecting the performance, searching for the lie, but seeing only a broken old hermit wrapped in filth and confusion. The tension escalated, a physical tightening of the air. The other two riders split off, circling the cabin, their horses crunching loudly through the drifts. Elias stood frozen, knowing that Sarah was beneath the floorboards, knowing that if they saw the drag marks near the door, marks the wind was frantically trying to scrub away, it would be over. He listened to the sounds of the horses passing the window, passing the chimney, waiting for the shout of discovery, but there was only the wind. The riders circled back, shaking their heads at the leader. The trail had gone cold, or the old man was telling the truth. The leader looked at Elias one last time, the suspicion not gone but deprioritized, replaced by the urgent need to keep moving before the trail vanished completely under the coming snow. "If she comes here," the gunman said, leaning down until his face was a mask of shadow and threat, "and you help her, the frost won't be what kills you." Elias just nodded, drolling slightly, playing the fool to the bitter end. "You got whiskey?" he asked suddenly, a greedy, pathetically. "Cold aches in the bones." The gunman sneered, disgusted, and wheeled his horse around, kicking it into a gallop without a backward glance. The men rode off, not vanishing, but moving up to the ridge line, establishing a perimeter. They were leaving the gate, but they weren't leaving the valley. Elias watched them go, his body remaining slumped in the posture of the fool until they were truly out of earshot, and then, like a steel spring uncoiling, he straightened, the intelligence rushing back into his eyes, the tension in his jaw revealing the warrior beneath the rags. He had bought them time, but he had not bought them safety. The siege had merely begun, and the cinematic tension of the moment lingered long after the hoofbeats had faded, leaving Elias standing on the porch, a lone figure against the white, holding the weight of the coming storm on his shoulders. "While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon." "All right then. Let's get back on the trail." The cabin, for all its sturdy oak and chinking, had transformed in Elias's mind from a sanctuary into a coffin, the silence of the room amplifying the feeling of the walls closing in, for he knew with the instinct of a creature hunted that the men on the ridge had not truly left, but had merely pulled back to watch the mouse hole, waiting for hunger or fear to flush their quarry into the open. To stay was to die, trapped in a box of timber while Vance hired guns waited for the cover of night to set the roof alight. So the decision to move was not made with words but with a grim, silent preparation that spoke of desperation. Elias extinguished the fire, the sudden absence of heat hitting them like a physical blow, and guided Sarah out the back, bypassing the wagon that had saved her earlier in favor of the horses, their hooves wrapped in burlap sacks to muffle the crunch against the ice, a trick learned from a lifetime of avoiding things that wanted to kill him. They rode not toward the town, where the roads would be watched by vain sentries, but up, into the teeth of the high country, ascending toward the jagged spine of the Absurica range where the air was thin enough to starve a fire and the wind stripped the flesh from the bone. The journey was a slow-burn nightmare of vertical ascents and sliding shale hidden beneath the drifts, the horses heaving with exertion, their breath freezing instantly on their muzzles, while Sarah clung to her saddle horn with hands that had lost all feeling, her consciousness flickering like a candle in a draft. Elaine led them through the blinding white, navigating by landmarks only he could see, a twisted pine that looked like a grasping hand, a rock formation that resembled a sleeping bear, moving them deeper into the wild to find the only justice left in a territory bought and paid for by corrupt gold. They rode until the sun began to dip, painting the snow in bruised hues of purple and blood orange, until they reached the narrow fissure in the granite face of the mountain, a hidden throat of stone that swallowed them whole, shielding them from the wind and the prying eyes of the valley below. It was here, in the shadow of the peaks, that they found him, standing as still as the stone itself, wrapped in a buffalo robe that blended perfectly with the rock, a figure who did not seem to occupy the landscape so much as he was an extension of it. This was 2 Moons, an elder of the Crow people and a ghost from Elias's past, a man whose face was a topographical map of history and sorrow, lined deep by the sun and the years. There was no greeting, no handshake, just a slight nod of recognition that bridged a decade of silence, a minimalist exchange that conveyed more trust than 1,000 written contracts. 2 Moons gestured them inside the cavern behind them, a vast, cathedral-like space where a small fire already burned, its smoke spiraling up through an unseen vent in the rock ceiling. The transition from the brutal, screaming cold of the mountainside to the hushed, ember warmth of the cave was an abrupt tonal shift, a sensory shock that made Sarah gasp as the heat hit her frozen skin. Elias lifted her from the horse, her legs useless blocks of ice, and carried her to the first spread near the fire, laying her down in the circle of light that flickered against the ancient soot-stained walls. This was the bridge in the storm, the place where the narrative paused to breathe, and the visual metaphor of the firelight played out in the dancing shadows, the golden glow illuminating the innocence of the woman's exhausted face while casting the jagged, violent shadows of the men's weapons against the stone, a stark representation of the duality of their world. 2 Moons moved with a fluid grace that belied his age, kneeling beside Serenat with a clinical detachment Elias had shown, but with a reverence that transformed the act of healing into a ritual. He did not ask who she was or who chased her. The needs of the guest were sacred, a mortal contrast to the transactional cruelty of Silas Vance, who measured human worth in water rights and fence lines. The elder produced a pouch of soft deerskin, taking from it dried leaves and a pungent, earthy salve that smelled of sage and crushed pine needles, and he began to tend to Sarah's ruined feet. The silence in the cave was profound, broken only by the crackle of the cedar wood and the soft murmur of the horses shifting in the back of the cavern, a peace so deep it felt subversive in the face of the violence hunting them. As 2 Moons worked, chanting a low, rhythmic song that sounded like the wind moving through dry grass, Sarah watched him through half-lidded eyes, her fears slowly dissolving into a confused wonder. She had been taught that men like this were savages, dangerous to be driven from the land. Yet here, in the heart of the savage wilderness, she was finding the only tenderness she had known since her husband died. The cultural bridging was not spoken but felt. It was in the warmth of the elder's hands, in the way he treated her wounds not as injuries to be fixed but as a spirit that had been bruised. Elias sat on the other side of the fire, cleaning his rifle, watching the scene with a heavy heart, realizing that the line between civilization and savagery had been drawn in the wrong place by the people in the towns below. The firelight caught the tears that finally leaked from Sarah's eyes, not tears of pain, but of release, the emotional resolution of a woman who realizes she is no longer alone. The elder looked up, his dark eyes catching the reflection of the flames, and spoke for the first time, his voice a gravelly rumble that filled the cave. "The storm cleanses," he said, the words simple but laden with meaning, implying that the wind outside was stripping away the old life to make way for something new. "The cold takes what is dead. The fire keeps what is living." He offered Sarah a cup of herbal tea, the steam rising in a delicate ribbon, and as she took it, her trembling hands steadied. The cave became a womb, a place of gestation before the rebirth that the dawn would demand, and for this one long, stretched-out moment, the violence of the world was held at bay by the flickering light of a fire built by a friend. The visual cue of the firelight reflected in their eyes bound them together, the rancher, the widow, and the nomad, three desperate souls forging a silent alliance against the encroaching dark. It was a scene of profound intimacy, the calm eye of the hurricane, where the dialogue was unnecessary because the action spoke of a humanity that Vane and his hired guns had long ago forgotten. Elias looked at Two Moons, and then at Sarah, and he knew that they were no longer just running away. They were running toward something, a redemption that could only be found in the high country, protected by the old ways that the new world was trying so hard to erase. The wind howled outside the cave mouth. A frustrated beast denied its meal, but inside, the fire burned bright and steady, a beacon of defiance in the heart of the winter night. The sanctuary of the cave, with its ancient firelight and the murmuring wisdom of Two Moons, faded into a memory the moment they crossed the timberline and entered the throat of the canyon, a narrow, twisting scar in the earth where the sun struggled to reach the valley floor and the shadows held a permanence that felt like a physical weight. The wind here was different. It didn't scream so much as it funneled, a concentrated stream of freezing air that pushed against them like an invisible hand trying to force them back. But they pressed on them, the horses skittish and rolling their eyes at the towering walls of granite that rose on either side like the tombstones of giants. Elias rode in front, his posture slumped with exhaustion but his eyes scanning the rim, scanning the scree, scanning the impossible angles where a man might hide. Yet the ambush, when it came, did not announce itself with a shout or a warning, but with a sound that shattered the world, a single, flat crack of a rifle that echoed off the stone walls a dozen times, turning the canyon into a chamber of thunder. There was no cinematic slow motion, no moment of realization. 1 second Elias was riding, and the next he was gone, plucked from the saddle by an invisible force that slammed into his shoulder, his body hitting the frozen ground with a sickening, heavy thud that sounded nothing like glory and everything like meat hitting a butcher's block. The horse reared, screaming, its hooves flashing in the dim light, and Sarah's own mouth bolted, spinning her in a chaotic circle of panic and snow spray. The abrupt tonal shift was violent and absolute. The quiet tension of the journey was instantly replaced by the deafening roar of adrenaline and confusion. Sarah fought the reins, her hands numb, her mind reeling as she saw Elias writhing in the snow, a bright bloom of red expanding rapidly across the shoulder of his coat, a stark, terrific contrast to the pristine white around him. Another shot rang out, chipping the rock inches from her head, spraying stone dust into her eyes, and the reality of the situation crashed down on her. The protector was down. The invincible mountain man who had carried her from the storm was now just a pile of broken bones and bleeding flesh, and she was alone. She threw herself from the saddle, landing hard on her bad feet, the pain spiking up her legs like lightning. But she crawled through the slush, crawled through the horse manure in the blood, dragging herself toward the only cover available, a slab of fallen shale near where Elias had fallen. He was conscious but gray, his eyes wide with shock, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps, his right arm useless, the hand that had held the Winchester now limp and empty. The rifle lay 5 feet away, half buried in the drift, a piece of metal and wood that suddenly represented the only difference between life and the grave. Elias looked at her, his lips moving, trying to form the word run, but the sound was lost in the echo of a third shot that thudded into the ground between them. Sarah looked at the rim of the canyon, seeing the shapes now, 3 men moving down the slope, confident, taking their time, weapons drawn. They weren't rushing because they knew they had won. They had killed the wolf and now they were coming for the lamb. And in that moment, staring at the men who had hunted her, something inside Sarah Miller broke, not the break of a collapse, but the break of a fever. The terror that had defined her existence since the moment Vane took her boots evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that was sharper than the frost. She was done running. She was done bleeding. She looked at Elias, then at the rifle, and the transition was instant. She scrambled for the weapon, her fingers clawing into the snow, gripping the cold walnut stock. It was heavier than she expected, a dead weight of steel and mechanics, alien to hands that knew only the weight of down fabric. She dragged it to her chest, the metal biting into her cheek as she clumsily found the lever, racking it back with a grunt of exertion, the brass casing ejecting with a cheerful ping that sounded absurdly domestic in the chaos. She didn't know how to aim. Not really. She only knew that the barrel had to point at the things that wanted to kill her. She rested the heavy octagon barrel on the rock, the sights dancing wildly as she tried to steady her breathing, lining up the iron bead with the dark shape of the lead gunman who was sliding down the scree. She didn't think about the morality of it. She didn't think about the Bible verses she had memorized about turning the other cheek. She thought about her husband's laugh. She thought about her frozen feet. She thought about the deed in the wagon. She squeezed the trigger, not a gentle press but a desperate yank, and the rifle kicked against her shoulder like a mule, a violent, bruising slam that knocked the wind out of her. The boom was deafening, far louder than the shots from the rim, a roar that seemed to come from her own chest. She didn't see where the bullet went, but she saw the lead gunman dive for cover behind a boulder, his confidence shattered by the realization that the prey had teeth. She racked the lever again, the action smoother this time, fueled by a primal rhythm of survival. She fired again, blindly, angrily, the bullet sparking off the rocks near the second man, sending him scrambling back up the slope. She wasn't a marksman. She was a force of nature, a storm of lead and fury that forced the attackers to keep their heads down. She fired until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber, the silence rushing back in with a ringing intensity that made her ears scream. She lay there, panting, the smell of spent gunpowder sharp and acrid in her nose, a smell she would never be able to scrub from her memory. She looked at Elias, who was staring at her not with pity, but with a kind of terrified awe. She looked at her hands, blackened by the powder, trembling not from cold but from the aftershocks of violence. She had crossed a threshold. The woman who had wept in the cabin was gone, left behind in the snow, and in her place lay a survivor holding a smoking gun, realized through action rather than exposition, understanding for the first time that the only thing that stopped a bad man with a gun was a good woman who refused to die. The shadows on the canyon wall seemed to stretch longer, reaching for them, but Sarah didn't flinch. She reached into Elias's coat pocket, her fingers brushing his blood, and pulled out a handful of cartridges, beginning to reload the weapon with clumsy, determined movements, the metallic click-clack-click of the bullets sliding into the gate serving as the new rhythm of her heart, the sound of a woman who had decided that if she was going to hell, she was going to take Silas Vane with her. The sun did not set so much as it surrendered, abandoning the canyon to a darkness that felt ancient and absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of indigo that extinguished the world one rock, one tree, one breath at a time. Under the shelter of the shale overhang, the temperature plummeted with a violence that made the very stones crack, a sharp, rhythmic popping sound that echoed like distant gunfire in the stillness. But Elias Thorne no longer flinched at the noise. He sat propped against the rough granite, his legs sprawled uselessly in the snow, his body a broken landscape of pain that was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to fade into a dull, throbbing numbness. The bullet in his shoulder had done its work, shattering more than just bone. It had severed the connection between the man he was and the man he would be tomorrow, leaving him stranded in the long, stretching now of the winter night. He watched the steam of his own breath rise in thin, ragged plumes, each one shallower than the last, measuring out the time he had left in increments of gray vapor. Sarah sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, the rifle resting across her lap like a talisman, her eyes scanning the darkness where Vane's men waited. But Elias knew they wouldn't come tonight. The cold was doing their work for them, a patient executioner that didn't need to waste ammunition. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and in the moonlight that filtered through the clouds, her face blurred, the sharp lines of the widow softening into the features of a woman he hadn't seen in 30 years. The delirium was creeping in at the edges of his vision, a soft, fuzzy vignette of memories that overlaid the brutal reality of the canyon. He tried to move his hand, to check the bandage she had tied so tightly, but his fingers refused the command, feeling like wooden dials belonging to a stranger. "It's funny," Elias whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, the dialogue woven seamlessly into the fabric of the night, lacking the strength for projection. "The cold. It burns at first, then it just lies to you, tells you it's warm." Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide and luminous, filled with the fear she was trying desperately to hide for his sake. She reached out and took his good hand, her skin rough and cold against his, but to him, it felt like touching a stove. She didn't hush him. She didn't offer the false hope of "you'll be fine" that the living always offer the dying. She simply held on, anchoring him to the earth as he began to drift. The silence stretched between them, a vast, empty canvas, and Elias felt the sudden, crushing weight of all the things he had never said, the secrets he had carried like stones in his pockets up into these mountains. He needed to set them down. He needed to be light enough to leave. "I wasn't always a hermit," he said, the words stumbling out, tripping over the thick tongue of hypothermia. "I was a man. With a name. With a house that had curtains. Blue curtains." He paused, catching his breath, the effort of memory exhausting him more than the ambush. He told her then, not in a linear story, but in fragments of regret that fell from his lips like shards of glass. He spoke of a winter just like this one, 3 decades ago, when he wore a badge that shone like a silver star. He spoke of a duty that he had let become an idol, a worship of the law that had blinded him to the needs of the heart. He had left them, his wife, Martha, and their little girl, to chase a cattle thief across the territory line, a man who had stolen nothing more than 3 head of stock. It was a matter of principle, he had told himself then. It was a matter of pride, he knew now. He had ridden for 2 weeks, obsessed with the hunt, feeling wretched in his saddle, only to return to a house that was silent, the chimney cold, the fire long dead. The fever had come while he was gone, a thief far deadlier than the one he had clapped in irons. He described the way the house felt when he walked in, the stillness that was louder than any scream, the blue curtains drawn against a sun that no longer mattered. He had failed them not because he didn't love them, but because he had loved his own image as a lawman more. "I fixed the world," Elias squeezed, a tear leaking from the corner of his eye to freeze instantly on his cheek, "and I let my own world burn down." Sarah squeezed his hand, the pressure fierce and grounding. She didn't judge him. She didn't pull away. In the deep emotional insight of the moment, she became his confessor, the vessel into which he poured the poison of his past. She understood the guilt of survival. She carried it herself for the husband she couldn't save, for the boots she couldn't keep. "You're here now," Sarah said softly, her voice a balm against the raw wound of his soul. "You didn't leave me. You didn't leave this time." The words hit Elias with the force of revelation. He had spent 30 years punishing himself, hiding in the high country, believing he had forfeited his right to protect anything ever again. But here, at the end of the road, in the shadow of death, he had stayed. He hadn't ridden away when Vance's man came. He hadn't chosen the easy path. He had taken the bullet meant for a stranger. The realization washed over him, a bittersweet wave of redemption that didn't undo the past but perhaps balanced the scales just enough to let him rest. The pain in his shoulder was gone now, replaced by a heavy, drifting sensation, as if he were floating in a river of dark water. He looked up at the strip of sky between the canyon walls, where the stars were burning with a cold, indifferent brilliance, witnessing his end just as they had witnessed his beginning. He felt a profound connection to the woman beside him, a bond forged in blood and ice that was stronger than the years he had lost. He wasn't dying alone in an empty house. He was dying as a guardian. "Sarah," he breathed, the name barely a ghost on his lips. "The deed. Don't let them take it. Don't let the whimper win." She leaned close, brushing the hair from his forehead, her face a mask of sorrow and strength. "I won't," she promised, and he believed her. He closed his eyes, not because he wanted to sleep, but because the light inside his mind was suddenly brighter than the moon. He saw the blue curtains. He saw the fire in the hearth. He saw the door opening, not to the cold, but to a warmth he had been walking toward for 30 years. The wind howled through the canyon, a lonely, mournful sound, but Elias Thorne no longer heard it. He was listening to the silence of the ghosts, and for the first time in a lifetime, they were not screaming. The long night had finally come, but it brought with it a peace that the day had never offered. Leaving Sarah to keep the vigil, a lone sentinel guarding the body of a man who had finally found his way home, the dawn did not arrive with the gentle grace of a morning prayer, but with the violence of a forge being lit, the eastern horizon bleeding a bruised and angry purple that slowly, agonizingly, gave way to a searing, molten gold that set the rim of the canyon on fire. Sarah Miller watched the light creep down the granite walls, measuring the remaining minutes of her life by the inch, her back pressed against the cold stone of the overhang, the rifle resting heavy and useless in her lap, its magazine empty, a hollow metal club that was the only thing standing between her and the men who had hunted her through the snow. Elias lay beside her, his breathing shallow and hitching, a ragged sound that tore at her heart, his face gray as the ash of a cold fire, and she knew that if the sun rose fully before help arrived, it would shine only on their corpses. The silence of the canyon was broken not by a gunshot, but by the crunch of boots on snow, deliberate, arrogant steps that made no attempt to hide. Silas Vane emerged from the shadows of the tree line, a silhouetted cut from darkness against the blinding brilliance of the snow, his breath misting around him like a dragon's smoke. He did not have his gun drawn. He held his hands out, palms up, a gesture of mock peace that was more terrifying than a threat, for it signaled that he believed the game was already won, that the prey was trapped and the slaughter was merely a formality. He stopped 20 paces away, his expensive coat pristine, his boots, the boots he had not stolen, polished and black, a stark contrast to the bloody rags wrapped around Sarah's feet. "It's a beautiful morning to die, Mrs. Miller," Vane called out, his voice smooth and cultured, echoing off the canyon walls with a clarity that made Sarah's skin crawl. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He owned the valley. He owned the law in the town below. And in a few moments, he would own the water that ran beneath her land. Sarah forced her legs to work, fighting the agony that shot up her shins, and stood up. She used the canyon wall for support, rising inch by inch until she was upright, a broken, swaying figure that refused to kneel. She didn't look at Elias. She looked straight at Vane, her eyes burning with a fever that wasn't from sickness. "You can kill me," she said, her voice raspy but steady, the dialogue weaving through the narration like a strand of barbed wire. "But you'll never hold that title. It dies with me." Vane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He took a step closer, his confidence absolute. "Oh, Sarah, you think I don't know? You women, you're sentimental. You keep the things that matter close to your heart. It's in your coat, or maybe stitched into that ragged dress. I'll find it. Warm or cold, I'll find it." He signaled to the men behind him, and they racked the slides of their rifles, the metallic clatter sounding like the tumblers of a lock falling into place. But then, the ground began to tremble. At first, Sarah thought it was her own weakness, the shivering of her exhausted body, but the vibration grew, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that resonated through the soles of her battered feet and shook the snow from the pine boughs above. Vane froze, his head snapping up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the canyon mouth. He expected his own reinforcements, perhaps, or a rock slide triggered by the thaw. What he saw instead was the sun, the rising sun, cresting the ridge in a blinding explosion of light, and silhouetted against the burning disk were not 3 riders, but 20. They lined the rim of the canyon like Judgment Day itself, the sunlight flaring behind them so they appeared as avenging angels composed of shadow and fire. The leader of the group raised a hand, and the sunlight glinted off a silver star pinned to his chest. A United States Marshal, brought to this specific coordinate of wilderness not by chance, but by the column of black smoke that had risen from 2 moons' fire the day before, a silent language of the plains that Vane, in his arrogance, had never bothered to learn. The confusion on Vane's face was immediate and total, the mask of the untouchable Baron chattering to reveal the frightened, small man beneath. He looked at the rim, then back at Sarah, realizing the trap had closed not on the mouse, but on the cat. "You can't prove anything," Vane hissed, his voice rising in panic, desperate to salvage the narrative he had constructed. "She's a trespasser. A thief. She stole the deed." Sarah stepped forward, leaving the support of the wall, standing under the full weight of the rising sun which bathed her in a golden, sanctifying light, washing away the gray of the long night. She didn't hold up a weapon. She didn't hold up a piece of paper. She simply held up her empty hands, palms open to the marshal on the ridge, and delivered a blow that would destroy Silas Vane more completely than any bullet. "You're looking for the deed, Silas?" she asked, her voice ringing out with a clarity that silenced the wind. "You tore apart my house. You hunted me across the ice. You thought I was foolish enough to carry my life in my pocket?" She paused, letting the words sink in, savoring the mystery revealed that turned the entire chase into a fool's errand. "It's not here. It never was. It's in their barn, Silas, tucked under the seat of the wagon you walked right past. The wagon of the man you just shot." The color drained from Vane's face as the implication hit him. He had committed murder for a piece of paper that was sitting safely in a barn 30 miles away, protected by the federal law that was now staring down at him from the canyon rim. The marshal's voice boomed down from the height, amplified by the acoustics of the stone. "Drop him, Vane, or by God, leave you for the buzzards." The clatter of Vane's rifle hitting the frozen ground was the period at the end of his sentence. His men, sensing the shift in the wind, threw their weapons down instantly, raising their hands in surrender. Vane stood alone, stripped of his power, stripped of his dignity, staring at the woman who had outwitted him not with strength, but with the endurance of the winter itself. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She simply slumped back against the rock, the adrenaline draining away to leave her hollow but whole, sliding down until she was sitting next to Elias again. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the faint but steady rhythm of his heart, and looked up at the sun which had finally cleared the canyon walls, flooding the world with a blinding, brilliant white light that promised warmth, that promised justice, and most of all, promised that they had survived the dark. The Wyoming winter did not relinquish its grip all at once, but rather retreated in a slow, grudging surrender, the white silence of the valley gradually replaced by the symphonic dripping of 1,000 icicles weeping into the mud. It was the season of the Chinook, the warm wind that ate the snow, revealing a landscape that was scarred but undeniably alive, a world of brown earth and emergent green that smelled of wet pine and possibility. Sarah Miller stood on the porch of her home, not the charred ruin Vane had burned, nor the temporary shelter of the cabin, but a new structure of golden, unwithered timber that smelled of sawdust and resilience. She held a porcelain cup in her hands, the steam rising in lazy spirals into the crisp air, and looked out over the pasture where the creek, finally liberated from its icy armor, ran loud and fast, singing the song of the water she had fought so hard to keep. She was wearing boots, new ones, sturdy leather laced tight against the chill, purchased not with charity but with the coin of her own cattle, a tangible symbol that she was no longer the barefoot widow running from a ghost, but the matriarch of her own destiny. Down the muddy track that wound through the aspen grove, a buckboard wagon appeared, its wheels caked in the heavy clay of the thaw, creaking with the familiar, comforting rhythm that Sarah felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. It was the same wagon that had carried her broken body away from death, but today it carried a man who looked less like a savior and more like a neighbor. Elias Thorne held the reins, his left arm stiff but functional, the sling gone, his beard trimmed back to reveal a face that had remembered how to smile, however faintly. He didn't stop at the gate. He drove right up to the porch, the horses blowing soft, wet breaths that misted in the morning light. There was no frantic urgency today, no looking over the shoulder for a gunman or storm clouds. Elias climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft earth with a squelch that felt grounded and real, and walked up the steps with the deliberate gait of a man who is nowhere else he needs to be. He took off his hat, twisting the grim in his hands, his eyes scanning the new house, the glass in the windows, the smoke rising from the chimney, and finally settling on Sarah. "Coffee?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken conversations. "Black," Sarah replied, the dialogue woven into the narration with the ease of old friends, lacking the desperate minimalism of the blizzard. She poured him a cup from the pot she had left on the railing, and they sat together on the bench, watching the shadows of the clouds drift across the valley floor. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the cabin, nor the terrified silence of the canyon. It was the companionable silence of the thaw, a peace earned through violence but sustained by connection. Elias took a sip, the heat spreading through him, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't feel the urge to retreat to the high country. He looked at the blue curtains hanging in Sarah's window, a detail she had added not for him, but which he recognized as a quiet nod to the story he had told her in the dark, and felt the last of his self-imposed exile melt away with the snow. He realized that penance wasn't about suffering alone in the cold, it was about stepping back into the warmth when the door was opened. He had saved her life, yes, but as he watched the sun glint off the rushing water of the creek, he knew with a profound, heart-wrenching clarity that she had saved him right back. She had dragged him out of his tomb of regret and forced him to care, forced him to bleed, forced him to be human again. The war with Silas Vance was over. The land baron was awaiting trial in Laramie, his empire dismantled by the very paper Sarah had hidden in this man's wagon. But the greater victory was here, on this porch, in the simple, revolutionary act of drinking coffee with a friend. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, two survivors of the long night who had found that the morning, against all odds, was worth the wait. The story of the barefoot widow and the hermit rancher had ended, but the story of Sarah and Elias was just beginning, written not in blood and frost, but in the quiet, enduring script of daily life, as the image of them sitting side by side fades slowly into the golden hue of the timeline. We are left to wonder about the nature of the battles we fight in our own lives. We often believe that strength is measured by the weight of the weapon we carry or the enemies we destroy. But perhaps the true measure of a hero is found in the courage to let the winter go. So I ask you this, is redemption earned by the sword that strikes down a villain? Or is it earned by the heart that is brave enough to open the door, let the stranger in, and simply, thou? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.